Okay, so we thought we'd just try and talk through the bottom quarter of the AMBIT wheel, which we call learning at work, and without wanting to kind of labour it too much, but I think there was quite a bit of thinking about why learning was at the bottom of the wheel, which is that's the bit of the wheel that has contact with the road. It's where the rubber kind of hits the road, and it's where you get traction. Because I think the point of AMBIT is less, in ways, to teach people a whole load of tricks and ways to do things. It's more to try to invite teams into becoming a bit clearer and learning their own ways of doing what they do, and kind of getting themselves into a frame where they purposefully try to change and develop their culture and their customs, if you like, to become more effective, to become more helpful.
So the rest of the principles and practice in the other three quadrants kind of rest on this foundation of keeping learning as a team.
Yeah. And while we were sort of just talking about what we'd want to say in this conversation, it's not entirely off pat. But one of the things that we thought is there were kind of four particular sort of points that we really wanted to just kind of think about together a bit. And the first was, staying with the wheel, that as with the rest of the AMBIT wheel, there are these kind of principles of practice that go around the outside, that it's really hard to get one right without getting the other one to go a bit out of balance. And at the bottom of the sort of learning part of the wheel, you've got these kind of this tug of war between what we would think of as kind of respect for evidence. That actually there is some evidence out there that we know some things are more effective than other things. But that on its own, evidence very rarely actually perfectly fits the clients that I'm working with.
And in fact, it's very difficult to get evidence about what works with a client group who've got lots of problems going on at once, where it's really complicated.
Yes.
How do you do a randomised controlled trial for the sorts of interventions we're talking about? And when they do those kind of trials for things like depression, say they're testing, does a particular approach, a CBT approach, work for depression? What they want to make sure is that they're really testing that. So if you're depressed but also using substances or also being abused, actually you're excluded from those studies, because then it makes it a bit harder to see what they're testing. So almost kind of by their nature, people who've got, unlucky enough to have more than just sort of one pure problem, they're much less likely to be involved in trials.
Yeah. And another issue around the sort of, if you fall too heavily on that, what we will do is respect evidence, is that actually you're limited to quite a small number of things that have kind of, if you like, achieved that kind of golden star thing, and you end up, if you like, offering something that the books say is the right thing, but my heart of hearts as a kind of a worker who knows these streets, has worked with this kind of culture, understands this organisational structure, I might in my heart know at this point, just following this set of instructions, it's just not going to go right. It's not going to give that sense of fit.
Because presumably the research might be based on a team doing this work in New York. How do we know that that's definitely going to work in rural Suffolk?
Absolutely. So the sort of the counter to that, this respect for evidence, which we think is incredibly important, it's disrespectful to ignore evidence, and where we can, we should use evidence. But the counter to that is that there's also a respect for local practice and expertise, because all of the teams, I think we can say, all of the teams that we've trained over the years in AMBIT, they're pretty skilled. They've got a huge knowledge, not only of the local services and what else is available and who else does what and the relationships that they have with it, but they also have a kind of a lot of knowledge about this particular client group, which, with the greatest respect, you or I don't have. So if you like, AMBIT itself, we talk about it being sort of evidence informed or evidence oriented. But I think I'd be cautious about ever saying this is evidence-based practice, because it suggests there's a set of very clear, concrete instructions. And we would want to think of how does a team respect its own practice and expertise? And if you like, how does it bring together evidence and experience? And, you know, evidence is important because if a team just followed its own experience, actually that's also a bit of a recipe for disaster. We just make it up as we go along. You know, you and I, we know what to do. Well, that's kind of evidence suggests that is not a safe way to work. So that's the first kind of question, is this tension that, like everything else in the work that we do, we're pulled between these two kind of positions.
We often use the phrase that about the importance of local adaptation. So I think that stands for AMBIT. We definitely don't have a kind of off the peg, you know, here's a recipe for an AMBIT service. We often talk about AMBIT influence services, because what we want to do is for people to take these ideas and adapt them for their local context, for their local setting. And I guess we would say the same about other evidence-based kind of approaches, that actually you've got to work out, not necessarily doggedly, you know, follow a very prescriptive manual, but work out how that makes sense, how that works best in your particular setting, based on your practice-based evidence.
So we're not after AMBIT teams. We want teams that we hope can be helpfully influenced by AMBIT and build their own understanding of what works best and their own development on, if you like, some of the sort of foundation stuff, the trenches and the drainage systems that AMBIT has worked with a lot of workers to think about what the really important bits to keep our balance.
So the next bit is that we want services, teams to be able to keep learning, or to become what's been called a learning organisation. How do teams achieve that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really helpful thing, because a learning organisation, there's lots that people could read about that, but it's an organisation that can keep adapting. And there's a phrase that gets bandied around, it's a bit of a bumper stick, you know, adapt to survive. That if you don't adapt, you're a dinosaur. You die out, you're a dodo. That it's our ability to learn from what's going on. So the question then is, how as a team do we create a culture where we constantly keep our minds open to looking at where actually are we not doing very well, and what would we need to do to get back in balance, to do a little bit better. In one sense, there's we're asking a team to mentalise, which is a little bit paradoxical, because mentalising is something that my mind might do of you, or your mind might do of me, whereas actually a team is not a mind, it's a collection, it's made up of lots of minds. But I think that's where we've kind of got this sense that there is a sort of moral duty of a group of people trying to kind of practice, that we keep systematically stopping and thinking, why do we do it like this? When should we be doing it like that? Is this actually helping in the way that we thought it was? And then we keep that kind of openness in our minds. And that's easy to say, but it's really difficult to do, because when we're under pressure, we just keep doing what we do because that's all we can do to keep afloat, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a risk that either we keep on just doing this because, well, that's what we've always done, so that's how it's done, or kind of slightly more riskily, well, that's kind of how I like doing it. That's what fits best for me. That's what's most comfortable. And actually, sometimes learning can be a slightly challenging, unsettling experience when you learn that the thing that you thought worked doesn't actually work that well.
It's very true. We get very kind of wedded to our expertise. And that, I suppose, is where evidence comes in. And the evidence might come from outside, from sort of upstairs there in some learned journal, but it might come from our team in some meaningful way measuring our outcomes and finding out that, we're great at working with this age group or this set of problems, but you know what, we recognise we're not doing very well with them. And then we would be open to sort of learn better ways of doing it.
I think it's helpful thinking about the different levels at which outcomes measurement can be helpful. There's one at a kind of an individual client level, which is that, are you getting better? Are things feeling better? Are you doing better when you leave this service than when you got here? But as you say, there's a much broader kind of service-wide thing at looking at, do most people get better? Are there people that we help to get better, more than others?
Yes. So the third thing, we've talked about this sort of tension, we've talked about the idea of this ideal. It's a bit of an ideal. We want to try to create a way of helping teams to become learning organisations. And the third thing is more of a sort of practical element of that, which is one of the ways that we've maybe stumbled upon that helps teams to create this kind of learning is this word that I don't know if we sort of made it up, but it's kind of a word that we use a lot, which is manualising. Kind of a little bit like one of those car manuals, which you kind of read how to change I was about to say distributor cap, but they don't have them in cars anymore, but you know what I mean. How to, the kind of step-by-step approach. Well, our manuals are very different from that. And one of the differences is our manuals are not printed as a kind of book that never changes. Our manuals are things that we're more interested in manualising, and that a team starts in a sort of quite a small way, but to write about how we do what we do and why we think we're doing it like that and not like that. But when might we try to do something like that? So a team that, if you like, is manualising its practice as a group, not Liz or me running off and writing on what I think the team should do, but that we've had some collective discussion and we've kind of come up with 3 or 4 bullet points. We think that a team that's manualising its practice is the nearest you can get to a group of minds mentalising their practice. Manualising and mentalising has a kind of nice kind of...
Yeah, I mean, from my own experience in teams of manualising, the analogy that often comes to mind that describes that kind of collective mentalising of what we do is that when you manualise, it's like you move position, you kind of step back on your own practice. That in the day-to-day kind of rushing around doing this work, you can't really see the wood for the trees. It's like you're in the middle of a dense forest because you can't see the whole thing at once because you're in it doing it. But if you can just create this space to do this manualising thing, it's like kind of, being in a drone. You can't be in a drone, they're tiny. But being in the position of a drone, looking down on the whole thing, and you kind of go, oh, that's kind of curious. I hadn't really looked at it like that
So
before.
You're kind of taking a perspective or a reflecting on practice.
Yeah.
And that, very neatly, as if we hadn't planned it, takes us to the sort of fourth point, really, which is we've got a few ideas about helping a team to mentalise its own practice. But the discipline is about making space, because you were kind of implying that can feel a bit dreamy, a bit of a luxury. It's like kind of, hey, who wouldn't like to sort of sit around with the team and go, kind of, we could do it like this, we could do it like that. But our argument is really a serious one, which is that actually the team that doesn't purposefully, deliberately make space is actually, they're just drifting. They're just drifting and they're not learning, they're not moving forward. And also it's more difficult as a team for us to come around as though, we've got a kind of a flag that we all can stand underneath. Not in a tribal way, but in a way that helps you and I understand each other and our practice, and we become a more well-connected team.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
I mean, I think there's other effects that it has sometimes for workers, is that they feel more ownership over the practice, that this is something we've created together, and that can really just help, keep enthusiasm for the work.
Yes. And some teams choose to manualise by having a document, a Word document, or a handwritten book or something. We've used, and not all the teams in AMBIT have used this, but those that have, we've been very impressed with. We use these wikis, and a wiki, for those that don't know, is like an easy to edit website. And I think that this really sharpens a discussion. So what we're going to think about with teams is you have these conversations that are quite focused, time limited, about a particular area of our practice, but that it doesn't just end with us all nodding and thinking, yeah, that's a very good idea, great, we've sorted it. It ends with us actually agreeing 3, 4, 5 bullet points that we publish openly on the web, that we invite our young people or our clients or other service users or other practitioners to have a look at, say, this is our work in progress. This is what we're aspiring to do. And a team that's having a conversation that will end with a kind of a publication on the web, if you like, that kind of just wakes everybody up, because it matters to me that you and I have kind of haggled it out enough that we've got a few points that we think are in common. And we feel quite strongly, I think, I hope I'm speaking for you, I think I am, that's kind of creates a bit more energy around the idea of a team that is genuinely, openly exploring its practice and generously sharing it.
Yeah, I think there's a theme throughout AMBIT about moving things from being implicit to explicit. And I think some of manualising is thinking, actually, we do have some quite well thought out and developed over time approaches to things, and starting to make it explicit that actually this is how we do it, and here's why, but also here is when we might not do it like that. You know, we might do it in a different way, but it's starting to get much more explicit. Some of those sort of unwritten rules about how a team works sometimes.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so just to finish, I think, when we very early versions of AMBIT, we used to really encourage teams to talk about the most tricky, difficult problems first, and to try and manualise their solutions. And I think that's a great thing for a team to do, but a better place to start is to get teams to start by manualising things that they already feel really kind of quite proud of, that they've got some particularly neat ways of fixing maybe quite a small area of the problems that they manage, but that they feel confident about. And it gets a team into that sense that actually this is nice, because this becomes an induction document that a new member of the team could come and look at and think, okay, that's how you guys do this. And it becomes a kind of culture carrier.